It really is just a thrill and an honor for me to be here, and I'm going to be talking to you, as Mumie said, about 3 topics, broadly called the social benefits of education in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as South Asia. Okay. So the basic gist of the talk is as follows. We hear a lot about the private benefits of education, right? Better jobs, better earnings, more likely to be a full-time employee, all of those things, right? I mean, that's typically what you hear about in terms of the benefits of education. And there's extensive literature there, right? How people are make more money, are more satisfied, have a better position in society as a result of educational attainment. But let's think back to the original goals of education. Okay, so if you go back several decades, and especially several hundred years, much of the reason why people got educated was because of the social purposes. That is, society benefits from having educated people. Right? From having more education, you gain from having from citizenship, from social cohesion, from moral development, and everyone, from Aristotle at least, all the way to your president, Amy Gutman, has written quite extensively about this topic. Right? How society benefits from having well-educated people. And so the question that, the questions that I'll be exploring today look at whether or not society is benefiting from education in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And I'm going to be presenting 3 studies, and the first question is, so the general question is, does society benefit from having educated people? And I'm going to give you the most annoying of all answers that social scientists often give is, it depends. Does society benefit? It depends. And it sounds like a cop-out, but hopefully it'll make a little more sense. So I'm going to present 2 topics on the Middle East and North Africa. The first is going to be on education and support for democracy. This I prepared for just this seminar. There's ongoing work on returns and protests, also on the Middle East and North Africa. And then finally I'll talk about education and support for corruption in India, which is from a recently published paper. So let me first talk about education and support for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, so if you hear, much of the literature, or if you look at much of the news, there's a great deal of focus on democratic advancement in the Middle East and North Africa. Many of you were very young when the Iraq War started, but again, it was very much about, democratic advancement in Iraq, and what we read about now and what we hear about in the news is also about democratic advancement in the Middle East and North Africa. And so this is a very sort of simple way of seeing, well, is education related to democratic advancement in that part of the world? Why should we care about democratic advancement? Why should we care about there being democracy? If you look at the literature, if you look at the empirical literature, what you find is that democratic regimes with regular and fair elections, more civil rights and liberties, are generally better than authoritarian regimes for social welfare and economic growth. Okay, so if you look at countries which sort of have a more democratic setup tend to do that. Now, how does education come into this? Well, whether the people of a country are supportive of democratic advancement, or supportive of democracy, depends critically on their attitudes. And how are people's attitudes shaped? They're shaped by education. Okay, so we know that the education system instills democratic attitudes, and because we know that, again, a lot of scholars have looked into this issue of what extent does an education instill these democratic attitudes and these other good things that we want from the education system. So we know a fair bit about how education is related to support for democracy and preference for civil liberties and those kind of outcomes in Western countries, but we know very little about the relationship between education and democratic advancement in the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, and so that's what we're going to, I'm going to talk about today. And so the data sets I'm going to use, these are empirical studies. Okay, so the data sets I'm going to use are 3 rounds of what is called the Arab barometer. How many of you are familiar with the Latino barometer or the Afro barometer or the Asian barometer? These are public opinion surveys. Okay? So they go on and they ask people about a variety of questions about life satisfaction, political preferences, social preferences, and so on. And so this Arab Barometer project was started as a collaboration between the University of Michigan, Princeton University, and universities and think tanks in the Middle East and North Africa. The first round, wave 1, took place in 2006-2007. The second round took place in 2010-11. Coincidentally, that happened to be when the Arab Spring took place, where you saw mass demonstrations across the Middle East and North Africa. And the third wave took place in 2012-14, and the data just recently became available. If you're interested, the data is freely available for download on the Arab Barometer website. Now these are public opinion surveys, so they go to a country, and they interview about 1,200 people. They interview about 1,200 men and women, and they ask them a variety of questions, and the surveys are nationally representative. Okay, so they, we can make generalizations about the nation or about the country themselves. So what countries have been included in the Arab Barometer? So the countries include Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen. And what these checks indicate is whether or not they were included in a particular round. This is wave 1, 2006-07, wave 2, 2010-11, and wave 3 is 2012-14. And as you can see, during the first round, it was a more modest effort. They only went to a couple of countries. By wave 2, they had expanded the number of countries considerably, and by wave 3, we have many countries in the East and North Africa agreed to participate. Now, before I proceed, some appreciation of this effort is necessary. Okay, so this is a part of the world where you don't talk politics. So I spent a good deal of my life in this part of the world, and you don't talk politics. You don't question authority. You don't sort of talk about policies that the current leader has enacted. You just don't criticize. So the fact that you have a public opinion survey in Saudi Arabia where people are talking about what they think of the current political setup, or even in a much more open society like Jordan, where you have people talking about what they think of their king and the political setup, the economic setup, it's not something you could have imagined 10, 15 years ago. Okay, so this is a real advancement. Okay, so again, to give you a general feel for the countries that we'll be looking at. So if you look at the gross national income per capita adjusted for purchasing power, the poorest country is Sudan, just about $3,300. This is again after adjusting for cost of living. So imagine people surviving on per capita income being about just over $3,000. Yemen is very poor as well. But then if you want to sort of look at the next round of countries, Iraq, surprisingly, about over $14,000. We're not saying it's equally distributed, but that's the average. These are average income numbers. And then, unsurprisingly, you have Kuwait with $84,000 per capita income. Okay, again, we're not saying anything about how that's distributed, but these are just the average numbers that you can get. Now, one of the phenomena about this part of the world are that people are fairly highly educated. The education systems in these countries have expanded. So even though you have these authoritarian, political setups, the education sector has expanded and people have access to education, and that's evident in the mean years of education, the average years of education. So at the lowest end, you have Morocco with 8.6. So the average adult in Morocco has 8.6 years of education. But then at the higher end, you have Libya with 12.8 years of education, which suggests that the typical Libyan has more than a high school degree, that they have just under 1 year of college. Now, the way to interpret that is there are a good number of Libyans with college degrees. Okay, so the educational attainment in general is on the high side. Okay, secondary education attainment and above. If we think about the political regimes or the political setup, most of these countries are authoritarian. Some of them are hybrid regimes where you have elements from authoritarian regimes and elements from democratic regimes. And then you have, for example, Tunisia, which is described as a flawed democracy. It's a democracy, but it's slowly advancing towards a more advanced state. Okay, so the way to think about this is authoritarian regimes are sort of at the bottom in terms of democratic advancement. Hybrid regimes are sort of one step above. And then flawed democracies are next, and then you have functioning democracies at the very top. Okay, so what we'll be discussing is, to what extent people prefer moving up, prefer more democratic regimes. Yeah, please.
Where are these classifications coming in from?
Oh, sure. So this is The Economist magazine, which has a democracy index. So that the regime classification are from there. And there are others. There's a polity index. There are others which aren't updated as frequently, but this is just a simple classification. And there are rankings as well, and not all of them are ranked the same. So Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Yemen are at the very bottom of this democracy index. And Tunisia, worldwide, they rank very low. If anything's unclear, please feel free to stop me and ask, okay? Okay, so this first table is examining how people just generally feel about democracy. Okay, so a typical person in these countries was asked, do you agree or not, or disagree, that a democratic system may have problems, yet it is better than other systems? Okay. So this question is basically asking them, what are your general thoughts on democracy? Okay. Do you think it has its problem, but it's better? And if we look at the numbers here for the three waves, in general we see a good deal of support. People seem to like the idea of a democracy. They agree that it's not perfect, but that it's a good thing. So if we look at from the 2006-2007 wave, the lowest number is 51%, and the highest in Algeria, and the highest number is 85%. If you move to during the Arab Spring, the lowest number is from Saudi Arabia, 72%. About 3/4 of people like the idea of a democracy. They think it's a good setup. And 90% of people, the highest number in that year, was Tunisia. 9 out of 10 people believe that a democratic system is the best system. And then very similar for 2012-14, where you have about 3/4. The lowest number is 72% in Yemen, and the highest number is 84% in Lebanon. Yes?
So are all these numbers, these ones and the previous ones, are these based on the people that were part of the Arab barometer? Or is this taken, okay.
Oh, sorry. So these are numbers that I've computed using the Arab barometer.
Okay.
Okay, so I took the questions and I didn't drop anyone, and the response rates were very high. They were very close to 100% everywhere. So it wasn't that people excused themselves from answering this question. Very high response rates, and these are the numbers that they gave. Okay? Yeah, please.
Just curious about,
of course.
Related to the question about a classification of countries, did the survey ask people if they thought they were not a democracy?
Yes, it did.
They supported it. I was just curious whether
Yeah.
they were supporting it.
Yeah.
Is that, it seems like maybe their classifications may not be consistent with the economist classification.
Yeah. So, I have to verify whether their own perceptions of whether they're in a democracy are consistent with the official classification. I think that in itself is is a paper, right? That's why these things are such great ideas. Yeah. So. I have to remember that, just in terms of outside perceptions versus internal perceptions. I think that's a great question. Yeah.
I've been to some of those countries.
Yeah.
I'm studying something about them right now. I listen a lot to BBC and I hear a lot from there. Okay. So my question is, representing the answers, who asks whom, what question, how, and the answerer or the respondent is giving what answer to whom For
Yeah.
what reason, under what circumstances?
Oh,
No,
yeah.
it sounds
No.
very nebulous.
No, but
But culture enters into
Yeah,
every
yeah.
question and every answer.
yeah. Yeah, it's especially true in this part of the world where, your responses could have consequences. There may be repercussions from saying things in a certain way. And I think, part of why, so this data set got the award from the American Political Science Association. And part of the reason for that is they did it in a very, as careful a way as possible. So they collaborated with people there, universities and respected sort of researchers there, pollsters there. And they were about as careful as you could become. But I'll show you some numbers in a couple of minutes where you'll still be like, I'm not sure about that response. So I agree with, I understand your overall point. And I'll show you a graph in just a moment which might convince you, which might support what you're saying. Okay, so here the general conclusion is that people like the idea of a democracy. Now, if you want to do something, however, like talk about patterns over time, it gets messy. Okay, so if you wanted, we can think of, yes, over time, in 2006, 2007, before the Arab Spring, people were not that excited about democracy, and then the Arab Spring came and everyone got excited about democracy, and that wave has continued. You're not going to see that pattern. Okay, so for example, in Algeria, there was a huge jump in support for democracy from 2006 to 2007, and then it sort of plateaued, it sort of flattened. Okay, so 51% to 82.8% of people all of a sudden started supporting democracy. That's a massive jump. But it's not the same, in every country. So, we see an increase in Egypt from 78.5 to 83.8%. But you also see some weird patterns like in Iraq. In 2010, 2011, 87% supported democracy. By 2012, 2014, there was a drop. Okay, in Jordan, it increased from 72 to 80, but then it flattened. Lebanon increased, flattened. Morocco, it went down. Palestine, it increased significantly and then flattened. Sudan, it was flat. Tunisia, it went down. Yemen, it went up and then it went down. So I guess the main point I'm trying to make is, there is really no pattern. In some countries, support for democracy went up during this period. In other countries, it went down. Okay? Now, again, so this question is about general feelings about democracy. Now, when you ask people, right, what do you think about, or is democracy appropriate for your country? Okay. So now they're thinking about, okay, whether it's democracy is the right political set up in my country, all of a sudden you see the numbers deflate considerably. Okay, so then, in the lowest number in Yemen is 54, it's 85 in Morocco, but over time, for example, in Iraq, only less than half of the people think that democracy is appropriate for their country. So they might like the idea of democracy overall, but when you ask them, is it appropriate for your country, far fewer people think it's appropriate for their countries. In some cases, the numbers are about half of what we had previously seen. And similar patterns there. There is really no pattern. If you want to sort of say, well, what happened in the Middle East in terms of people's feelings or attitudes about democracy in their country? Some countries it went up, then down. Other countries it went down, then up. Other countries it remained flat throughout. It really depends on which country you're looking at. And so, what I'm going to do now is present some very basic regression results, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the likelihood or the probability that someone's going to support a democracy. Okay, so the outcome is yes or no, support democracy, and the explanatory variables. That is, I'm going to see how educational attainment, secondary educational, vocational education, higher education, age, gender, marital status, whether they live in a rural area or not, just how these variables are associated with support for democracy. Okay, very sort of simple results that I'm going to present today. Again, if any of this is unclear, please let me know, okay? So let me give you, yeah, please. Yeah.
There's a debate about
Yeah.
using the linear probability model with a
Yeah, yeah.
dichotomized dependent variable.
Yeah.
Maybe you can enlighten us.
Yeah,
Use it.
Yeah, I did the probit as well. No difference. So it depends on the data. Sometimes it varies. In this case, it didn't at all. So it's just in the next study I used probit. So in this particular data set, it didn't matter at all. Okay, so before showing you some of the actual numbers, let me give you, a summary of what the results are going to be. Okay. Now, I only found a positive and statistically significant relationship between educational attainment and support for democracy in less than half the countries. If you believe education is associated with increased support for democracy, we would have expected positive and statistically significant coefficients for all of the countries. I didn't find that. I find that for less than half of the countries. Okay, so this idea that education is going to lead or is associated with greater support for democracy, that has some support. It depends on the country you're looking at. Now, if you look closely at the data, what you find is this inverse U-shaped distribution. Okay? Now, what does that mean? What that means is if you look at people and you pretend all other characteristics between them are the same, location, gender, if all of those are the same, what you find is the people who are most likely to support education are those with secondary education. And then less likely than them are sort of the people with just a primary degree and higher education. So the most supportive people people who are most likely to support democracy are people with just a secondary education, no higher. And the people with primary and higher education, they're about equally supportive. And that's why you get this inverse U-shaped distribution. Okay? So we would have maybe expected the more education, the more supportive, this sort of upward sloping, the more education, the more supportive you are. That's not what the data show. It actually shows that the secondary educated are most supportive. Yeah?
It's probably not something that could be contained in this study, but in terms of like the paradigmatic approach, so if I have a secondary education and my education tells me that democracy is awful, So what is actually happening? Was there any attempt to what is the actual education, not just the fact that they have education, but what are they being taught?
So you basically, that's my last slide, okay?
Sorry.
And, no, but you've said it, and I'm glad that you were able to predict this. Now, if you look at data sets like this, there are no questions about, well, what did you actually learn in school? Right? If there are questions about your curriculum, what did you learn? How did you interact? Even things like, how you interacted with teachers. Was it very sort of a teacher lectures you listen, or is it more sort of, there's more dialogue involved? Those questions aren't there in these sort of surveys. There's no way that you can actually go in other than some, there's some qualitative things that you can do, and I'm going to, talk about some of those. But that's exactly it. This is just to get a sense of what's going on and give you clues on deeper issues that may be going on, just like the one you raised. Okay, so here are some numbers, and what these numbers basically mean are, if you see an asterisk, it means there's a statistical relationship. That means that there's a correlation. Okay, so what I have in these two columns are data for the Arab Spring years, 2010, 2011. This column tells you how much more likely a person with secondary education is going to be than a person with less than a secondary education. So for example, in Egypt, a person with who's completed secondary education is 8.9% more likely to support democracy than a person without a secondary education. In Egypt, a person with a higher education is 8.4% more likely to support a democracy than a person without secondary education, holding other factors constant. So right here you can see this inverse U shape, right? Who's more likely to support a democracy? The person with a secondary education, 8.9 versus 8.4. Now I know those are very close, but what we refer to as point estimates. But again, you see that there's no, people with higher education it's not like they're much more likely to support a democracy. Okay, so you see similar patterns here. You see similar patterns in Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Yemen. And there's some, again, it depends on which year you look at. So, for example, in Sudan, we saw a relationship in 2010-11, but we didn't see a relationship in 2012-14. In Egypt, we saw a relationship in both waves. I'm not showing the 2006-2007 results. I'm just sort of didn't want to crowd the table. And so again, it sort of depends what year you're looking at, but there's, for about half of the countries where you see the green boxes, there's a positive relationship that's in the direction that we expect, but secondary education seems to be more strongly related. Yeah.
What are the negative inputs of the numbers?
The negative, good. I was just getting to that. So we have these weird instances of Jordan and Algeria in the second round. What do you think the negative signs indicate? Those with more education are? Exactly. Exactly. So we have these peculiar cases in Jordan and in Algeria where those with more education are less supportive of a democracy than those with fewer years of schooling. So for example, a person with a higher education, a university degree in Jordan, is 8.2% less supportive of a democracy than someone without a secondary education.
The reference group is primary school?
Below secondary, yeah. Most people have, yeah, so it's...
So you did secondary and below secondary. You did
Below secondary is the reference group. Sorry, I should make... Below secondary is the reference group. That's who I'm comparing to. And secondary is people who've actually completed secondary. Okay? The reference group, all of these are compared to people who've, not finished secondary.
But
Everyone here has almost finished primary, so that's why that can't really be a good reference group. So below secondary is the reference
did
group.
you also look at the difference between those who had higher education compared to secondary education?
Well, so to do that, you just compare these two, right? So if you want to compare higher education versus secondary, you compare 8.4 to 8.9, right? So these guys are 8.9% more than below secondary, and these people are 8.4 more than lower secondary. So it's 8.4 minus 8.9. So whatever that difference is, that's the difference between these two groups. Okay? Yeah.
I was wondering, given that you were mentioning, I think that there was considerable variability in the average level of education
Yeah.
in these places.
Yeah.
And in that, I was thinking that your reference groups in the different countries may represent different degrees of disadvantage. So in some cases, you may be getting very disadvantaged groups in the countries that have highly expanded education, and other
Yeah.
places it may be more of an average group. And I was wondering if that might be interesting to look at deviations from the average level of education.
Sure. Do you think the age cohort would have control for some of that, or if I control for age, or do you think it's better to go in?
Like across countries, if you've got different average years of schooling, that you'd still have that issue, I would think. I
Okay.
mean, it's not necessarily an issue, it's just a question of whether
Yeah,
you
yeah.
think that the absolute level of education is important, or it's
Relative.
enough how somebody's relative position.
Yeah.
I mean, either of those I think are interesting questions.
Sure. I'll look into that. Thank you. Yeah?
What type of schools are the primary schools? Are they Quranic schools or?
Yeah, so that's one of the, so in Saudi Arabia you can, I mean for example, there's compulsory religious instruction, but one of the biggest, I think, misconceptions is the prevalence of madrasas or Quranic schools in the Middle East and North Africa. It's tiny. So by estimates, in most countries it's less than 5% of all elementary and secondary schools. And even in a country like Pakistan, it's actually, this was, I think you were on the board of the Comparative Education Board, which gave out the madrasa paper, remember a couple of years ago, Emily, the Baraday Award, where it was less than Asim Khaja. So Emily Hannum is on the board of the Comparative Education Review. They gave an award to this paper which computed using different sources the prevalence of madrasa education in Pakistan. It was by Tahir Andrabi, Jishnu Das, and Asim Khwaja. So they wrote this paper, and less than 1% of students in Pakistan went to madrasa schools. So this madrasa explanation, or this Quranic explanation, isn't really doing it, right? Most people attend typical public schools. There might be some religious instruction, but by and large, they're very similar to the schools you see in other parts of the world. So that may be a part of the story, but it's not. It's not that 1% or 5% does not explain these overall patterns. Did that make sense? Okay. So then we get to the question of democracy being appropriate in your country, and you see that we even have fewer instances of statistical significance. There are even fewer boxes here. Right? So we don't really have a lot of evidence that educational attainment is associated with greater support for democracy in their own country. Okay? We're just not seeing, there is some evidence, a little bit of evidence in Egypt, but again, this is only for those with secondary education. In the second round, again, notice for Egypt, those with secondary education are 20.1% more likely to believe that democracy is appropriate for their country compared to those without a secondary education. But if you look at the university educated, they are only 10.8% more likely to support a democracy compared to someone with below a secondary education. So again, it's those with secondary education who are a lot more supportive. Something seems to happen once they go to university when they just stop being as supportive. Okay? And there's some very good sociological explanations for that. You want to sort of maintain your status and so on. We can maybe talk about some of those later. Morocco, again, a strange story where those with secondary education are less supportive of democracy in their own country compared to the least educated in Moroccan society. Okay. So here are some conclusions, just before we go on to the next paper. So if you were to ask, is education associated with greater support for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa? It depends. In a few countries, you observe this inverse U-shaped pattern. And what we mean by that is those people with secondary education tend to be the most supportive. Okay, so if you're talking about educational attainment going from primary to secondary, yes, there is an increase in support. But then once you get to higher education, either it plateaus, like either it flattens, they're no more likely to support democracy. And in some countries, it actually goes down. Those with secondary education are not very supportive. And in some cases, the least supportive of democracy in their countries. And then if you wanted to talk about time pattern, what has happened across the three waves in these three very sort of happening years in this part of the world, it's really hard to make generalizations. Okay, different countries experience different changes in attitudes. So this was sort of a warm-up. Okay, so this exercise was just to give you a feel for what the correlations are, what the relationships are between educational attainment and support for democracy in this part of the world. And the one reason I got into all of this is, I was in New York, as Mumie mentioned, and I was a grad student during 9/11. And when that happened, one of the big pieces of policy advice was, everything will sort of, things will stop if we only educated these people. It's lack of education, it's lack of income that's forcing people to sort of take on these extremist acts. That's forcing people to not embrace democracy. It's forcing people to, all of these socially undesirable things. And luckily, these data sets began to emerge where I was like, well, is it really lack of education that's behind, the lack of support for all of these good things that we want? And when you start to look at the data, there's in some countries the educated are support good things like they're anti-suicide bombing, they're pro-democracy and so on. But it's far from a clean pattern. Okay, so this was a very basic exercise. There's social scientists do this kind of exercise. So economists do it, sociologists do it, political scientists especially do it. The next study I'm going to talk about draws more from my area, which is the economics of education. So this is a study which looks at how educational returns, are related to protests. Okay? It's tentatively titled Returns in Revolution, and it's co-authored with an education economist at the University of Cambridge, Anna Vignoles. So it was a wonderful co-author. Okay, so this next paper, as I mentioned, looks at the relationship between education, income, and protests. Okay, and you may be familiar with the Arab Spring, which happened from December 2010 to about mid-2012. So these wave of protests across the Middle East and North Africa. And ever since it sort of started, we've had social scientists trying to understand why we had these uprisings in that part of the world. And so there have been a variety of very sensible explanations that have been put forward. One group of explanations has been its lack of democracy and corruption. Another explanation is it's the high food prices, it's the high cost of living, that's why people took to the streets. And there's been a third explanation as well, which has been put forward by many of by organizations like the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, and so on. And their explanation is as follows. The protests are initiated or occurred because of bad labor market prospects. Okay, if you think back to the Tunisian fruit seller Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire, right, which sort of started the Arab Revolution. What was his background? He was a university graduate who was forced to sell fruit, and he felt harassed, and he set himself on fire, right? And so the story there is, there are educated but frustrated youth in this part of the world, and they're the ones who protested. So if we sort of try and examine that explanation in a more systematic way, this is what we can say, okay? That people protested because they were not getting the kind of jobs and pay that they were expecting, given their education and experience. Okay? So people felt disenfranchised, people felt frustrated because they were not getting the kind of jobs that they thought that they were going to get. Okay, so just imagine yourselves, you graduate and then you don't get the kind of work that you thought you would get. It's not paying as much as you thought it would pay. And imagine your frustration there, right? So it's kind of that story, except it's far worse in that part of the world. For this study, we're only going to look at the second round, which was collected during the Arab Spring. So this data was actually collected while the Arab Spring was going on, while these mass protests were going on. Okay, and we focus on male labor force participants. We were very interested in female labor force participants as well, but female labor force participants, at least in the formal labor force in this part of the world, is very low, between 25 to 35%. That raises some methodological issues. Particularly, there are selection issues, so we didn't look at women. Male labor force participation, in contrast, is quite high, 80 to 91%. And the countries we consider are Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen. So if you think about the labor force distributions in any of these countries, there are about 50 to 60% of labor force participants are full-time workers. Between 15 to 20% are part-time workers. You can think of part-time workers as those that are underemployed, right? They work, but not, but they're not getting, full-time work. And then 10 to 20% are unemployed. Yes?
Sorry, I don't
Please.
know if you already mentioned this, but
No.
what are the sample sizes for this?
1,200, sorry. So for each of the countries, there are 1,200. About 1,200 people have been, adult men and women have been interviewed, so adult meaning 18 and above. And as I'll show you in just the next slide, that shrinks when you just could consider men who are in the labor market and who are of the 18 to 56 age group, who are typically make up the labor force. Okay? So it's not high, but it's adequate. It's not bad. And see, so these ends are your sample sizes. Okay, so the outcome, or the key sort of outcome variable that we're interested in, is protest participation. We're viewing protest as a social benefit. Okay, the fact that you're protesting for social change, that we view that as a good thing. Okay. Particularly given that these were by and large peaceful protests. So the question that was asked in all countries except Egypt and Tunisia was, during the past 3 years, did you participate in a protest, march, or sit-in? Okay, it's a yes or no question. Actually, they were asked, did you participate once or more than once, or never? These were the three options. A fourth option was that they chose not to answer. Okay, so we just collapsed the once and more than once into one category. And in Egypt, there were more specific questions about did you participate in anti-Mubarak, anti-Hosni Mubarak protests. And in Tunisia, there were specific questions about did you protest in President Ben Ali protests. And so these are the numbers that we get. Yeah.
So I have a clarification question.
Of course.
Because you said that you're defining protest
Yeah.
as a benefit of
Yeah.
social change, or
Yeah.
So the first question surprises me because a protest could possibly be for something completely unrelated.
Yeah.
Like maybe something that's religious or culturally motivated
Yeah.
in a way that was not necessarily directly related to the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
So was there any differentiating between that?
No. So, I mean, for Egypt and Tunisia, we could, the questions were very specific. But for the other countries, it was more general. Did you participate in a protest? Now, we took that to be, to be positive because, again, to protest in these sort of environments, any sort of dissent, we view as something, something that's, as something positive, right? If you're dissenting against a regime like this, if you're saying this needs to change, now we may not agree with the issue, but the fact that they're actually doing it is a good thing. And all of the documented, most of the documented protests that have happened are probably are things that you would sort of go, okay, that's not problematic. So protesting university fees, protesting high food prices, protesting unemployment, those are the kind of protests that have been documented in these countries. So we did actually look at newspaper articles which documented all the different kind of protests in these countries, and most of them seem to be the kind of protests that we would view as good things, right? Demanding that the government do something about, homelessness, things like that, okay? or refugees and so on. Thank you. Okay. Now, if we look at the numbers, okay, these are the protest rates for male labor force participants. Now, going back to your question, sir, about the numbers, can you believe it? Can you believe these? For Egypt, the number is 13%. 13% of male labor force participants said that they participated in a protest. Seems low, right? Given everything we saw in the press and the media and what anecdotal evidence tells us. So you look at the Egypt number and think maybe there's some underreporting going on.
Well, we also know that Egypt is a police state.
Yes, and you're terrified, yeah. Well, it's a police state, but at the same time, here you have, someone asking you questions at a time where the situation is very volatile. Now, as much as they say, your answers are going to be, confidential and all of that, do you really want to risk that, right? So I think it's a genuine concern where, you're thinking, well, should we really believe these numbers? And I think this number almost single-handedly, made us say that, okay, let's proceed with caution. But the numbers afterwards aren't too bad. In Jordan, it's about 12%, which is okay because, people in general are quite supportive of the Jordanian regime. Lebanon, about a quarter of the people. Palestine, a third of the people admitted protesting. Sudan, a third. Tunisia, about a third. And Yemen, nearly half. Okay, so those are the protest participation rates. So they vary from about 12% to about 50%, depending on which country that you look at. Now, the way, so let me talk a little about how this kind of research is typically done. And I've done this sort of work before as well, and very, very well-known and respected political scientists and social scientists have done this as well, where, the empirical model is protest participation determined by characteristics such as educational attainment, income, gender, region, and so on. To some social science methodologists, this is problematic. Okay, to include income and education in the same side of this equation, because these two are highly correlated, right? We know, for example, education affects income. So you can run this regression and you'll get some results, but it's going to be a little, you can't really believe the results. We violated some statistical assumptions. So what we're going to do is proceed in a couple of steps, okay? We're trying to answer this question about whether feeling disenfranchised as a labor market participant is connected with protest participation. So if you please, if you can bear with me, there are 5 steps that we're going to go through to show you how we sort of approach this research question as economists. So the very first step is what we do is, we have labor force participants who are full-time workers, part-time workers, the unemployed. We just focus on the full-time workers in every country. Okay? We focus on full-time workers in each country. And for each country, for the sample of each country, we estimate the most well-known regression in all of the economics of education, perhaps even labor economics, which is called the Minserian wage equation, or the human capital earnings function. All just very fancy terms. We have some fans, okay. So those are just fancy terms for having the natural log of earnings on this side, educational and explanatory variables being educational attainment, years of work experience, and work experience squared on this other side. You're wondering why natural log, why complicate things? It just makes it easier to interpret. Okay, and I'll show that in just a moment how exactly it's easy to interpret. So we run this regression for the sample of full-time workers in every country. Okay, and what this is going to give us, okay, if we literally just read our Stata output, this is sort of what we get. Okay, you get a coefficient for the constant, the years of education, experience squared. If you just look at the results from Stata, or whatever program you're using, let's say for Egypt it's 0.063. What this tells you is each additional year of education is associated with 6.3% higher earnings. So what does that mean? So for example, someone, let's take 2 Egyptians, one with 11 years of education, the other with 10 years of education. This tells you, and they're identical in every respect, okay? So this will tell you that the person with 11 years of education it will make 6.3% more than the person with 10 years of education. Or someone with 14 years of education versus 13 years of education, the person with 14 years of education will make 6.3% more than the person with 13 years of education. And so we have this for all of the countries here, 6.3% for Egypt, 6.4% for Jordan, 3.6% for Lebanon, 7.1% for Palestine, 1.9% only for Sudan, Tunisia 7.8%, Yemen 5.8%. So ranging between 2 to about 7%, depending on which country you look at. Now, what does this all mean from a comparative perspective? Well, worldwide, so if you think of rates of return in the US, it's about 6%. And so in these countries, it's also 6%. So what's the story here? That if you manage to find full-time work in one of these countries, you're doing fairly well, okay, by world standards. Okay, so these are high, fairly respectable private rates of return. This is what an individual gets from being educated, from additional education. So do these, yeah.
About that. So what
Yeah.
was the time span
Yeah.
for this data set?
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering, your first argument in the beginning
Yeah.
about no labor prospects, is that reflective of that?
No,
Or is
no.
this over a much longer period
No.
of time?
So this is, we're only considering full-time workers in this period of time.
Okay.
That's all we're doing. We're only considering those people who have jobs, full-time jobs. Okay?
During the Arab Spring.
During this Arab Spring. That's the only group we're considering. Okay? Now, step 2 is what we're going to do is we're going to predict the expected earnings for all labor force participants. Okay, so now what we're doing here is we're going to, for every participant, we compute what they would expect to earn using the results that we just got. Okay, so for example, If we want to find out what a Jordanian labor force participant with 10 years of education and 4 years of work experience should earn, we just take the results from the previous slide, the constant 5.08, rate of return of 0.064. You multiply with that with how many years of education they have, that's 10. 0.03 was the coefficient for years of experience. We multiply that by 4, which is the years of experience that this person had. And then coefficient for experience squared. If you just plug those numbers in, take any labor force participant, you just plug in the years of education and years of experience that they have into this equation, you are going to get what is called their predicted earnings. Now what we're arguing is that this income is what they expect. Just imagine yourselves, right? So imagine yourself going out looking for work, and then how would you know how much, you would expect a certain salary, right? How would you develop that expectation? Well, I know so-and-so from Penn, she graduated a couple of years ago. She had the same years of experience that I do. She's making $48,000. So I should be making $48,000. It's the same thing that's going on here. Okay? So we're assuming that people are looking at, the unemployed, the underemployed, will also be looking at full-time workers and saying, on average, a full-time worker with this many education, this much years of experience will make this much money. Okay, okay, so we do this for every person in every country, and then we get to step 3 where we compute the gap between actual and expected returns. So step 3, for every worker, for every labor force participant, we compute what is a gap, which is simply what they're actually making, their actual salaries, minus what they are expecting to make. So the actual earnings we observe, we know exactly how much someone is making. We have that data, what their monthly income is. We subtract from it what our results told us are what they expect to make. Okay, so again, suppose you were expecting to make $48,000, you go and you make $40,000. $8,000 less than this other person, right? So what's your gap? Minus $8,000. Someone else might be very lucky. You go and they tell you, well, you're going to make $60,000. Fantastic. Your gap is positive $12,000. And so our argument is that, if you do this for every person, you're going to get negative gaps where actual earnings are less than expected earnings. You're going to get positive gaps where actual earnings are greater than expected earnings. And rare instances, you will get exactly what you expected. In that case, there's no gap. So here's our idea. People who experience very negative gaps, like minus $500 a month, are going to feel very disenfranchised and are more likely to protest. Imagine again yourselves, if you got, $5,000 less than what you were expecting, are you happy? Probably not. How about $25,000 less than what you were expecting? Probably not, right? In contrast, if you got $40,000 more than you were expecting, forget protests. You're thrilled. You're happy with the way the world is. Okay, so we take, for every country, we line up from the most negative gap, let's say minus 10,000. We line up from the most negative to the most positive, and then we split that into 5 groups. We split that into quintiles. Quintile 1 are those who are at the low end experiencing very negative gaps. The next group is experiencing negative gaps, that is, they're making less but not as much. Quintile 3 are they're roughly making as much as they were expecting. And at the very end, you have quintile 5. These are people who are making a lot more than they ever expected. And so who do you think is most likely to protest? Here's a very simple, stating our hypothesis. It's those who are in quintile 1, that is those who are making very negative amounts. You can expect them to have very high probabilities of protest. And if you happen to be experiencing very positive gaps, you're making more than what you expected, you can, your probability of protest is going to be very low. Okay? And so again, we run a very simple model here, and where protest yes, no, and the explanatory variables are which gap you're in, and the reference gap is going to be gap 3, which is sort of in the middle, right? You're making roughly about what you expected to make. Gap 1 is you're making a lot less. Gap 2, or quintile gap 2, you're making somewhat less than what you were expecting. And so what are our results? Okay, so these are the only 3 countries where we find some, yeah.
What was the other grievances?
Oh, other grief. Thank you. I just went over that because of time. Other grievances are we control for other frustrations that they might have. Okay, so there are other frustrations relating to the political setup. So there are, so we want to control for all of those, pretend those are the same, and just focus on the labor market grievances of people. Okay, thank you. So those are included as control variables. Maybe that was worth going over. Okay, so for only 3 countries, we see a statistical relationship between between the gaps that you're facing, labor market disenfranchisement, and political protests. There's no relationship in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Sudan. Okay, so this labor market story, this labor market disenfranchisement story does not have, there's no statistical evidence supporting it for Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Sudan. Which is surprising because this was one of the key stories that was put forward for Egypt. But the data don't seem to support it. What would that suggest? Maybe, it still may be true, but in all likelihood it's probably something else that happened in Egypt that's responsible for the protest patterns. Okay? So essentially we don't see a downward sloping line in Egypt, Jordan, and Sudan. What we do see is a flat line between how much of which quintile you're in your protest participation. Something also, going along this theme of an inverse-shaped U, in Tunisia and Yemen, those in the middle, that is, they're neither privileged nor disenfranchised, those in the middle, whose expectations are basically being met in the labor market, they're the ones who are most likely to protest. Okay, so again, it's unexpected, right? It's not the most disenfranchised. They're not protesting. And in Palestine, we find some evidence for our model. We find some evidence for this, upward slope, this downward sloping line. But in Tunisia and Yemen, again, 2 countries that experience mass protests, we see the people in the middle who are, who the labor market was serving fairly well, relatively, being most likely to protest. So a couple of findings here. The first is, of this paper, so positive rates of return to education for full-time workers in all 7 economies. Something like this was doubted. It wasn't clear that people were benefiting from education, and as it turns out in these countries, you're a full-time worker, it pays off. But that whole story about labor force frustration and labor force expectations not being met, we don't find much support for it. Okay, so what that suggests is there may be other stories, there may be other reasons why people protested during then. So that brings me to the last paper. This was a paper that just was published recently in the journal World Development a couple of months ago. It's called Education and Moral Change, or Aspects of Moral Change in India, 1990 to 2005. So the big topic in the Middle East and North Africa has been political advancement, political change, democratic advancement. If you look at India, the big topic there has been economic growth, but along with that there have been 2 other topics. One is income inequality and the other is corruption. Okay, rising corruption in India. So here's a quote, so we know about the Indian growth rate of 6% from 1990 to 2006. Very impressive. India and China, 2 economic superstars. But as this is going along, as India is experiencing economic growth, we see observers starting to become, thinking carefully about the downsides of Indian economic growth. So this is a quote from the then leader of the Congress Party, the influential political party in India, Sonia Gandhi, in 2010, make the following quote. "The country's economy may increasingly be dynamic, but our moral universe seems to be shrinking. The principles on which independent India was founded, for which a generation of great leaders fought and sacrificed their all, are in danger of being negated." Now, many journalists and other observers have made similar observations. And some have come up with creative labels like moral decay in India. growing moral obtuseness, and ethical deficit. Okay, so many people have been making note of this, but the issue with that is, right, so you look at the Indian press, there's a lot written about growing corruption, and so when I began to write this paper, it wasn't about does education have, related to, is education related to moral change, or the question was simply, has India really experienced moral change? If you talk to our parents, they'll say, oh, the world today is much more immoral than it was before. You talk to our grandparents, it's an even more powerful story. So the question I was trying to get at in this paper is, has India really experienced moral gain? I was influenced by this other quote. Okay? Please bear with me. So, history has to a stage when the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving away, almost without knowing it, to make room for the commercial man, the man of limited purpose. This process, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. Okay? Pretty powerful. Can only be sort of put that way by a great poet, and of course we have the greatest, arguably, Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengal poet and Nobel laureate. He made this statement in 1917. So my point being, people have always said there's moral decay. Is this really true? So to give you, the punchline, yes, there is support for moral change or moral decay if you prefer. And is education associated with lower support for corruption or lower support or less likelihood of decaying morally? And the answer is yes. So the data for this are from the World Values Surveys for 1991, 1996, 2001, and 2006. So 4 rounds of the World Values Survey for India. This again is a collaborative effort with among social scientists from around the world. Now, to be upfront, the World Values Survey, it's a decent survey, but it's nowhere near as good as the Arab barometer. Okay, so it's a good effort, but there are critics about the quality of the World Values Survey is debated, but it's the only data set that was available to test this question. So there are many ways you can measure moral change or moral values. I look at cheating on taxes. So people were asked, would you cheat on taxes if you had a chance? Yes or no? And do you agree or do you think it's justified? Someone accepting a bribe in the course of their duties, is this justified? Yes or no? Okay, so 2 questions, one on tax evasion and the other question on bribery. Here are the numbers. Okay, so these are all adult men and women in India. And in 1990, when you asked people about whether they believe cheating on taxes is justified, only about 2% of people agreed that cheating on taxes or bribery is justified. By 1996, this inches up to about 3%, 2.5%. By 2001, it goes up to 11.5%, 9%. By 2006, about a quarter of people think it's okay. Was there a question? Or?
Oh, if the World Surveys was a .com or .org.
Oh, is it?
I'm sorry.
Google. Yeah, what did I have? It's an org. It's an org. Yeah, yeah. And then there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with this is to me, this doesn't prove or show that the society is more immoral, right? Because you have to look at what is causing that. Like, for instance, I'm from Venezuela. In Venezuela, nobody pays taxes, and everyone takes bribes because to get anything done, you have to bribe people. Really?
Yeah.
But it's the way the system. It doesn't mean like you have there's no other way of doing it. So it doesn't mean that as a person, like you're immoral or like you disagree with paying taxes. But if you know that if you pay taxes, it's going to go to the politician's pocket. So you just. So what does this tell me?
Yeah. So I mean, so the tax part is there and the bribery part is there. So again, the type. I think if we take a poll in this room, again, depending on where we come from, the idea of is tax evasion good or bad? Is bribery good or bad? There's going to be some variation in that way, right? So the argument, so we tried to stay away from that judgment aspect and sort of say that, whether you agree with this or not, the economic evidence suggests that this actually has a negative effect. So there's the greasing the wheels argument, which is this is just good, it's good for the economy, it's good for people's incomes. They'll do better if you have a system with this. But then there's the sanding the wheels argument where, this might look like a good idea, but it actually has negative implications and cumulative implications on growth. So I agree with your sentiment. Like how much are we really saying? Yeah, and was it a time thing or no? Yeah. Sure.
Freedom in theory
Yeah.
is wonderful to talk about.
Yeah.
Especially when males do the talking. In practice, it's not so easy because freedom means someday, everywhere in the world, every woman will control her own fertility with no input from anyone except herself and her medical support. Not her family, certainly not her husband, not her brothers and her fathers.
Right.
So freedom is easy for males to talk about. It's very difficult for people to talk about freedom for females.
Okay.
Just to
Yeah.
follow up on
Yeah.
what Irene was saying.
Yeah.
I think it's great that this is longitudinal, but I think also we have to look at the country context.
Yeah.
You brought up the context of
Yeah.
Venezuela. I grew up for a few years in Nigeria, the most corrupt countries
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
But I think in this case with India, India doesn't really have that tradition of corruption. In Nigeria, it's taken for granted.
Well,
Nigeria,
but
corruptible.
but it's
This is not against Nigerians. It's accepted.
But it started somewhere at some point, right? And whatever it is, this culture of corruption, whatever you label it, it starts somewhere. And I think that's what I was trying to do with this paper and sort of say that it started around this point. We'll go there and then here if you. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm Nigerian.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
The question
Yeah.
is going back to your comment about the quality of the survey.
Yeah.
So our class, we actually had a person come in last couple weeks ago, and she was talking about the ways that you ask the question.
Yeah.
Yes, and so there's a difference between, oh, this is okay in general, there's a difference between that, and this is okay for me, as you pointed out at the beginning, or this is okay for that situation.
Yeah.
And so I think, like going back to the data situation, this
Yeah.
talk about kind of not whether I do it, but what I believe, but even within the what I believe,
Yeah.
different facets.
Well, so
And just add
Yeah.
to that, can we go back to the question, or can you
Sure.
tell us
Sure.
how exactly the question was worded? Because
Yeah.
I'm wondering, maybe we're not measuring the value or the moralistic aspect.
Yeah.
We might be just measuring apathy. They don't care anymore.
yeah. So it's not. So I was pretty careful in framing it. So I call it tolerance for corruption. So it's not support for corruption. It's not like yay corruption. It's more like, okay, we tolerate it. It's justified. Even with that. But going back to your question as to how the question was asked, note so the first question on taxes is, would you cheat on taxes if you have a chance? Right? But notice the second question. Someone accepting a bribe in the course of their duty. So this is not you, this is someone else. And again, this was partly intentional because you want to sort of, you don't want that person to sort of be this, for this to be a personal question, right? Just to see if there are any differences. And remarkably, there were no differences. If you look at the number, whether it was asking the person themselves or asking about someone else, look at, they're very, very similar. Right. So again, I agree with you, but the main thing is you can think of it as cultural change, along with economic growth. However you feel about bribery or corruption, this is how things change. Let me show you another figure here. Okay. So this blue and red line are the exact same numbers that you just saw a couple of minutes in the last slide, and this green line is per capita income. So this talks more generally about, economic growth and social change. Okay, so here you're having this income tells you an idea about overall economic change, and the tolerance toward bribery and taxation give you indicators of cultural change. And what you see here is when GDP per capita is sort of rising slowly in the early 90s, bribery and tolerance for bribery and tax evasion are also rising slowly. Income per capita starts to increase rapidly, and you see these two increase rapidly as well. So again, we can't prove the causal story, but something to be said about, about economic change and social and cultural change happening at the same time. Yeah?
Just curious about the sample for
Yeah.
the different years.
Yeah.
I know that I had played around when I was a graduate student with data from China at the time when there wasn't much data from China, and trying to compare different samples over time. And at the samples, you could get some very odd patterns given the huge diversity within the country that may or may not have been attributable to change over time. And, and I know I've looked at I haven't looked recently, but I remember a while ago looking at the World Value Survey in China, only for one particular year, but I remember at that time that it was sort of an odd sample in the China context. And so I was curious if, I guess two questions about the sample. One is whether the sample is meant to be national, representative, or is it meant to be a particular subset like urban areas? And then secondly, is it drawn in a way is it possible that any of the change is related to a different sample, a different regional coverage or something?
No, it's such a great point. The issues you faced with China are true with India as well. Regions which were, for which they collected data in one round were not collected in other rounds. So that is a very sort of real issue and something that I had, that the referees were understandably, concerned about. And I'd written about it, saying that, look, this is the best we can do, and we have controls for them in the model, and you just sort of have to go with it. But the same issues plague this as well. That's why I said, it's a data set, it's there. It's not perfect, and but you're absolutely right. It's the same issue there, and probably many of your mentors were involved in the initial design of the World Value Survey. It started, the University of Michigan was a key part of this. So these are the main results from India. Okay. So if you just take all of the data sets, like if you pooled for all of the years, what you find is, if you just look at education, an Indian with higher education is 1.5% less likely to support tax evasion and bribery compared to an Indian without primary education, holding other factors constant. Now, I know it's not a large difference, right? 1.5% less likely, but it is statistically significant, and it is something, 1.5%. If you do a slightly more advanced model where you have time interactions, what you find is with each passing year, a highly educated Indian becomes 0.5 percentage points less supportive of tax evasion and bribery compared to someone without a primary education and holding all other factors constant. So imagine what's going on. We saw this increasing pattern for the average Indian, but if you hold all those characteristics constant, for every given year, a university-educated Indian becomes gradually less and less tolerant of bribery and tax evasion. Okay, so to give you some perspective on, so this result suggests that, there is an association between education and intolerance or rejection of tax evasion and bribery. So that's some suggestive evidence that higher education is a social benefit. Less support for corruption is a social benefit of higher education in India. There's some other results that I just want to go over before concluding. What we find is that the poorest and especially the richest are most tolerant. Okay, so this time we just have a U-shaped distribution. Okay, so if you ask the poorest, they're quite supportive of tax evasion and bribery, and the richest are very supportive of tax evasion and bribery. And who does that leave? The middle class. So the middle class don't like this. The richest and the poorest do. They are tolerant. There's no Hindu-Muslim gap. And now again, going back to the quality of data issue, or what people tell you, can you really believe? Men apparently are less tolerant of tax evasion and bribery than women. Okay, so the men are like, no, tax evasion and bribery, those are more likely to oppose tax evasion and bribery, or so they say. The highest tolerance you find are among people who are in high growth states. So high growth as in the states that experience the highest amount of economic growth, that's where people are most tolerant of tax evasion and bribery. But the least support are among the middle class, the middle growth states. So states that experience some middle levels of growth, they're quite against tax evasion and bribery. And the very low growth states, or negative growth states, they're also very supportive of tax evasion and bribery. So again, this U-shaped distribution. The low and the rich, people who live in the low growth and the high growth states are very supportive. Those in the medium growth are not. Some time patterns. Over time, Muslims compared to Hindus are becoming more tolerant of tax evasion and bribery. And over time, high growth states are becoming more tolerant, but middle growth states are becoming less tolerant. Okay, so it's, again, you can sort of think of this as, one interpretation. Maybe middle growth states are saying, we don't want these corrupt institutions. We don't want these corrupt, they're becoming more and more resistant to these ideas of, but these are for further exploration as well. So general conclusions, I think we've sort of gone over the general conclusions. What I would like to say is shortcomings in future research, going back to a point that was raised earlier. These are, again, correlational studies, not causal studies. They're just meant to give us a general sense of what's going on in these in these parts of the world. And it's really meant to do a couple of things. The first is, if you're a quantitative researcher, it's meant to sort of encourage the search for identification strategies, good identification strategies. That is, where you can really come up with good causal stories. Okay, using existing data or most likely with new data. And the second point, and this, as I said, this really was my very last point. I haven't said anything about the mechanisms through which education affect attitudes towards democracy or corruption or willingness to protest. I haven't said anything about that because I don't have data on that. And there's very limited good qualitative research on what exactly goes on in schools in this part of the world. So I think those are really important areas of research which can inform these large data set kind of studies that people like me conduct.
I would like to sincerely thank Najeeb for a very comprehensive, very thorough presentation, 3 presentations. And please join me in giving him a